All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Wisdom. My name is Robert Vidigal, and I'm your host for the workshop on international survey methods. Today, we have a talk from Dr. Pat Moynihan, who is an Associate Director of International Research Methods at Pew Research Center. Pat received his PhD from the State University of New York, Stony Brook, and prior to join Pew, Pat was a survey methodologist at the U.S. Department of State. He previously served as an assistant director of the program on survey research at Harvard University and also a senior polling analyst and consultant for ABC News. So Pat has published on a broad range of methodological and substantive topics, and the title of the talk today is Comparison of Modes in Sweden, Postal Push to Web versus Dual Frame RDD. Thank you for joining us today, Pat. The floor is yours.
All right, Robert, thank you. And thanks to the staff at the Center for Global Democracy for the invitation today to share some of our preliminary results from an exploration of an address-based sampling postal push-to-web data collection effort in Sweden. It's really exciting to be here. And thanks, folks, for attending today. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. Um, Let me give a little bit of a roadmap to people about how the presentation today will unfold. Uh, I'll say a few words about Pew Research Center first and our annual Cross-National Global Attitudes Project, and I'll describe our phone and our push-to-web designs. I'll focus a little bit more on the distinct elements of the push-to-web design, since that's the innovation that I want to focus on for today's presentation. Then I'll present a comparison of results between the GAP phone survey and the push-to-web results on response rates, sample representativeness, and attitudes. On attitudes, I'll highlight a few differences that are suggestive of a social desirability effect on specific subject matter. And then I'll end up with a few takeaways and thoughts about next steps. All right. For those unfamiliar, Pew Research Center is a nonpartisan, non-advocacy, nonprofit fact tank located in Washington, D.C. Our mission is to inform and enrich public dialogue about issues, attitudes, and trends shaping the world, and we do that by prioritizing data quality, accuracy, and transparency. And most of our work is public opinion survey research, as we'll discuss today. Now, the flagship cross-national survey of Pew Research Center is the Global Attitudes Project, which has been ongoing for over 2 decades. And we generally field between 25 to 40 individual countries annually. And the current wave is scheduled to field in 37 countries, as shown on the slide. In terms of questionnaire content, we typically include items about democracy, foreign affairs, religious beliefs and practices, among other topical issues. Full questionnaires and full methodology are available on the Pew Research Center website. Each year is a mix of new questions about issues of the day, and those are balanced with trend questions from previous years. And those trend items allow us to leverage data collected in previous years to provide greater context to current attitudes. The sample design in each country attempts to maximize total coverage to represent as much of a country's population as possible using probability-based random selection methods. Our coverage is almost always 90% of a country's population, and quite often it's above 95%. All right. Since we're talking about mode today, I thought I'd include a slide about the current mix of modes we intend to use for GAP 2026. You'll see in the slide, we have face-to-face marked in green. We use that throughout Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. Phone, and that's either dual frame or mobile only. That's marked in orange. Throughout Europe, we're using phone, but also in Canada and parts of Asia. And we included two mixed mode probability panels in Australia and the United States. In the US, we use our own American Trends panel, and those are described as online on the slide, and they're marked in blue. In Sweden, we use a dual frame random digit dial design, and we use a 9010 mobile landline frame allocation with landline stratified by nuts 2, and up to 5 contact attempts are made to complete an interview with adult respondents. Individuals are selected on landlines randomly using the Rizzo method, and interviews on mobile are conducted with the person who answers the phone, if eligible. Now, that's our phone design in brief. As for push to web, let me say a few words about what we did there. But before getting into the design specifics, I do want to acknowledge the obvious, that push to web is not a new methodology, as many have worked successfully on that mode. And that includes colleagues here at the Pew Research Center on the domestic side who've done a fantastic job with the center's National Public Opinion Reference Survey. But also, we should mention folks outside the US, most notably the researchers behind the European Social Survey. In fact, Rory Fitzgerald, director of the ESS, presented at this workshop last September, and he talked a little bit about the ESS's pivot to self-completion from the traditional face-to-face approach. More recently, just last week, colleagues at Varian and Eurofound presented via the ESS webinar experimental comparisons from the European Working Conditions Survey between face-to-face and push-to-web outcomes. So while an address-based push-to-web approach is new to the Global Attitudes Project, I want to be clear that many others, many on this webinar today, I'm sure, are quite familiar with this methodology. Okay. Exploring alternative modes for the center's cross-national research has been a cornerstone of our work for the better part of the last decade. On GAP alone, we've transitioned from face-to-face to phone in Italy, Greece, Hungary, Poland, and Russia. And we pivoted to the Life in Australia panel a few years ago to maintain our work there. We've explored face-to-face to phone transitions in Mexico, as well as potential transitions from phone to online probability panels in Europe. But for a combination of cost, quality, and long-term viability reasons, we decided to stick with the mode of record in those countries. We tend to focus our research time and research money on mode transitions because, broadly speaking, in some countries, traditional modes of data collection confront multiple challenges. We have rising costs. We have limited vendor space to maintain the data quality standards we require, and increasingly biased or at least less representative samples, as some populations have become harder to reach by door-to-door contact or via phone. And each of these issues comes into play when thinking about mode in Sweden. Consider cost. The cost per interview to survey a general population sample via dual frame RDD in Sweden for the upcoming wave of GAP is one of the highest CPIs for any country included in the 37-country project. So it's expensive. The Sweden survey last year averaged over 23 minutes with a maximum duration of twice that length. So it's a burden on respondents to complete a survey over the phone. The response rate, and that's APOR RR3 for those keeping score, from last year's survey in Sweden was 3%. Now, that's not a level unfamiliar to folks doing caddy surveys these days, but it leaves a lot to be desired. Now, on top of a low response rate, the demographic profile of last year's Sweden sample had clear deficiencies. Gender was off by 9 points from the parameter, age by 6 points off, underrepresenting the 18 to 29 age group. And on education, we were off by double digits, overrepresenting college graduates. These sample shortfalls are reflected in the design effect for last year's survey in Sweden, which was 1.68, yielding an effective sample size under 600 for a gross sample of 1,000, which is a high analytic cost to pay due to waiting alone. Beyond Sweden, it's fair to note that the impact of interviewer quality on survey response is an ongoing concern with interviewer-administered surveys, including potentially biasing effects on more sensitive items. So self-administered surveys like push to web have a built-in advantage in that regard. So you may ask, push to web, why that as an alternative to phone in Sweden? Well, as mentioned, push to web is gaining interest abroad, in part spurred by the COVID pandemic and a lack of high quality interviewer-based on operations in a variety of countries. The European Social Survey, for its part, has already announced plans to transition fully to self-completion for their round 13 scheduled to start in 2027. And that transition will build on exploratory work they did a few years ago during and after the pandemic, and it will also account for work they're currently undertaking with their round 12 data collection, which is being conducted in both self and interviewer administered modes to study the impact of mode on outcomes. In another example, the European Working Conditions Survey, as part of their 2024 project, fielded their traditional face-to-face survey alongside an experimental online questionnaire using push-to-web recruitment with the goal, in their words, and I quote, to future-proof the project long-term. So these projects offer evidence that push-to-web can work in Sweden. In fact, the ESS push-to-web survey achieved an unadjusted response rate of 36% with promising demographics, although admittedly they used a very ambitious design. The European Working Conditions Survey came in with an 18% response rate using a less robust approach. So in addition to these proof of concept studies, which were very important in us deciding to do push-to-web work in Sweden, another factor making Sweden an attractive location to explore push-to-web is the availability of a high-quality address-based, sampling frame, which is commercially available. And that's the Swedish State Personal Address Register, otherwise known as SPAR. The population coverage for SPAR is estimated at over 99%, as everyone who lives in Sweden is required to be registered, and the registry is updated daily. And as a registry of individuals, SPAR contains names alongside postal addresses, and that allows for direct sampling of and mailing to individuals, removing the need for within-household random selection or surveying multiple people within a single household, and if going that route, dealing with the challenges of a cluster design. It seems obvious, but worth mentioning that Sweden has a functioning postal system allowing for this design to be implemented. And that's not the case in all locations, not even across Europe. In Denmark, for instance, PostNord discontinued postal service at the end of last year. And for what it's worth, in the US, the Postmaster General testified last week about the Postal Service's financial struggles and that it'll be out of cash in less than 12 months, I quote, without major reform. So in thinking about a push-to-web project, we shouldn't take for granted a quality postal service. All right. Let me talk a little bit about some of the design specifications that we use. And in terms of a short summary, we can say our survey was designed using a nationally representative sample of adults 18 and older, using a proportionally stratified design based on NUTS2 regions drawn from the SPAR frame. Okay, that's a nice tombstone description. Let me say a little bit more. The postal push-to-web included an invitation letter mailed directly to sampled individuals, which was followed then by 2 reminders, and those were designed to arrive 1 week and 2 weeks after, respectively. In terms of transit, all letters were printed in the UK for this project before being dispatched by Royal Mail. They were then collected by PostNord, who arranged for delivery into Sweden and then distributed to sampled individuals. And let me note here, and I'll make a few remarks during the talk about some challenges we had. Let me say here that the actual delivery of the mailings missed the mark by over a week, given shipping delays that we experienced. In fact, it was a dock worker strike in Sweden last May, which caused initial holdups. And that's just one example of unfortunate occurrences that can happen to your timeline when you're depending on postal delivery. In all, Three contact attempts were used, and so we had the initial invitation letter, a reminder postcard, and then a final letter. And the final letter included a paper questionnaire and a postage-paid return envelope. All mailings included web access to the survey. Every respondent was provided with a unique login code. Respondents could alter text size and the background color of the online questionnaire to make it more accessible. And a privacy notice was available via links at the bottom of each and every survey page, alongside links to FAQs. All right. So let's take a quick peek at the mailings. And I use some blue arrows here to highlight key features of these letters. So first here is the initial invitation letter. Um, you can see well, maybe not too well. Sorry for the resolution. Take my word for it, folks. At the top of the front side, you can see that we have a little circle there pointing to an unconditional incentive of 20 Swedish krona. At the bottom of the front side, there's a signature of the head of operations for Ipsos Sweden for legitimacy, as well as the Ipsos logo on the top of the backside of the letter. And Ipsos was the partner in this project with us. Also on the front, there's a unique code to enter online to take the survey on the Ipsos provided website, as well as a QR code to get to the survey platform. On the backside, there's a list of FAQs, as well as data privacy information and contact information at the very bottom. All right, mailing 2, a postcard reminder. Yes, folks, that says an important piece is missing. It's you. And you see here on the front, there's a mention of the 100 krona conditional incentive for completing the questionnaire. On the back side of the postcard has much of the same information we just discussed about the initial letter, Ipsos logo, unique ID code, QR code, mention of the conditional incentive, and so on. All right, about those incentives. On all mailings, sampled individuals received an offer of a 100 krona voucher for completing the survey. As for the unconditional incentives, we experimented using a 2x2 design. Each sample individual was randomly allocated into one of 4 groups to determine whether they would receive an unconditional incentive or not. Okay, and here are the 4 groups. And folks could receive no unconditional incentive at any point with the 2 mailings. There was a group with no unconditional incentive at mailing 1, but a 60 krona incentive at mailing 3. Alternatively, there's a group with 20 krona incentive at mailing 1, but none at mailing 3. And then the final group for big money folks, these people received a 20 krona unconditional incentive at mailing 1 and a 60 krona incentive at mailing 3. Now, as one of the little hiccups we experienced, let me share with you that during preparations for mailing 3, the printers could not acquire sufficient supplies of 20 krona notes to accommodate the 60 krona unconditional incentive, and that was designed to be 3 20 krona notes. So instead, we used a 50 krona note, and that's a single bill. And that was another problem that arose, in part at least, from using an out-of-country operation for printing and assembling the mailings. We kept to paper banknotes and the readily available 50 kronas rather than attempting to send coins in our third mailing. I say that in case you're wondering why we didn't try some different combination of currency to get to 60 krona. In any case, for some of the results I'm showing later, I'm not going to discuss the differences between the 50 and 60 krona amounts, and I'll just treat them as, on the third mailing, receiving any incentive versus no incentive. In terms of setup, I want to mention that the field periods of the phone and push-to-web surveys did not overlap. As best we tried, we couldn't manage to get into the field with push-to-web to overlap with the GAP project. So the GAP phone survey fielded from late February through mid-April 2025, while the push-to-web survey fielded from mid-May through the end of June, outside of a small proportion of late replies, about 100 in all, as we left the online window open for the push-to-web survey, as this was our trial run. And that all refers to, at least with push-to-web, the online completes. The paper questionnaires, however, they're not timestamped, so it's unclear precisely when those questionnaires were completed. All right. Let me share with you folks uh, some of our results. We'll start with the response. In all, we received over 3,300 completes to the Push-to-Web project. 71% were online completes and 29% were by paper. Our overall yield rate, and that's the number of completes over the total number of sampled individuals across the entire Push-to-Web project, was 24%. Now that rate's a little bit lower than what the ESS got when they worked in Sweden a few years ago. They got 36%. But again, they used a more rigorous, more intense contact strategy with higher incentives. And I guess I can say it here, we had a challenge with the delays in postage, and especially with the third mailing, it was slightly problematic. And we made the mistake in hindsight with the third mailing of listing a survey closing date on the letter. Um, and because of the transit delays that we experienced, the letter on the third mailing arrived around the same time as the closing date listed on the letter, which was very unfortunate. Fortunately, though, we received about 40% of all completes in response to the third mailing, which we were pretty happy with at the end of the day. But it leaves open the question of whether we would have fared better without that snafu. And I guess this one simple and now obvious takeaway is with your mailings, folks, use encouraging but perhaps less precise language, such as the survey is closing soon rather than listing a specific date. But even with the hiccups in delivery, our 24% yield was still a bit higher than what the European Working Conditions project in Sweden got when they got 18%. But no, they did not include a paper questionnaire, though they did offer a higher conditional incentive of 225 krona, whereas we offered 100. What is clear with this discussion of response is that our push-to-web outcomes compare favorably to the 3% response we got for GAP by phone. The overall push-to-web yield of 24% does mask a little bit of nuance because we did find some differences due to the incentives. Those offered an unconditional 20 krona incentive on mailing one, and any third mailing incentive had a yield rate of 29%, and that was the highest across the range of incentive scenarios. In contrast, the lowest yield rate at 19% was under the condition of no unconditional incentive on any mailing. In fact, looking across incentive scenarios, the yield rate was 25% or above in each scenario that offered an unconditional incentive on either mailing versus 19% when none was offered. So that was encouraging for us. Looking at the response to the initial mailings by incentive condition, on the first mailing, the yield rate was 1.7 times higher with a 20 krona incentive included versus no incentive. And that yield difference on the first mailing essentially held through the second postcard mailing. Of course, the second postcard mailing did not include an unconditional incentive. All right, let me share a few results in terms of sample profiles. On this slide, going left to right in the columns, I have the census parameters for demographics, then the results from the GAP 2025 phone survey, followed by the push-to-web results. Now, I've listed two flavors of push-to-web in the last two columns. The full sample push-to-web includes all respondents to that mode. And it's admittedly a hodgepodge of incentive scenarios, but provides a general overview of how the entire push-to-web project panned out. In the rightmost column, you'll find the push-to-web results based on the first two mailings only. So these are all online respondents to those invitations. No paper results are included as the paper questionnaire was only available in the third mailing. These respondents that I'm presenting in this slide were also under the condition of receiving a 20 krona unconditional incentive with the first mailing. And I included this version of Push to Web as it represents an approach that would fit more neatly into our cross-national timeline while also possibly being a bit more budget friendly. In terms of sample sizes, we had over 3,300 cases in the full push to web sample and over 1,100 cases for the sample receiving only the first two mailings with the mailing one incentive. Okay. Now, with these sample profile results, a few highlights for you to consider. Starting with education in terms of demographics, the sample surveys each underrepresented those with less formal education, though phone is 5 points closer among those with the equivalent of high school education or less. Not shown here, but in terms of education, push to web, including the paper questionnaire, can help balance the education distribution because 38% of paper respondents are high school or less versus 33% of the push to web online respondents. But adding those paper respondents can have those paper respondents in terms of completing on the paper questionnaire, that can have a skewing effect on age, as 55% of paper respondents were seniors, 65 and over, which is double the parameter. In comparison, 27% of all online respondents were seniors, and that's within a point of the parameter. So there's a bit of a trade-off there, folks. The paper advantage on education is arguably offset by its impact on age. Speaking of age, our phone sample underrepresented those under 30 years of age and overrepresented seniors, which is essentially where the full push-to-web results landed. But as I just alluded to, the push-to-web version with only two mailings fared a bit better on age. For instance, you can see the figures in the last column match the parameter figure for those under 30, and that's a group that can be a real challenge to get in our phone surveys. With gender, our phone survey uses a 90-10 mobile landline allocation, which unsurprisingly underrepresents women at 41%. As you can see, push to web had a more balanced distribution, both the full sample push to web and the online to mailing with incentive version. I didn't include region distributions in the table because, as you might expect, the mode relying on postal address was as good or a bit better than phone when comparing nuts to regions. Let me make a side note here regarding incentives. There is evidence that incentives can shore up demographic representativeness. For instance, based on these variables in the slide, the incentive scenario with no first mailing incentive, but any incentive on the third mailing yielded a better demographic profile than phone on gender and region. And actually, it was a bit better on education and had about the same age distribution. And we need to dig into that a little bit more, but calibrating incentives seems to be a point for us to think about a little bit more as these preliminary results offer some promise on that front. Note the effective sample size row toward the top of the slide, and that may be unsurprising given the demographic results I've described. The effective sample size for a sample of 1,000 cases would be smaller based on the phone survey design effect of 1.68 versus 1.51 for the full push-to-web sample and 1.59 for the online to-mailing push-to-web sample. Also on this slide, towards the bottom, folks, I included our partisan identification and political ideology unweighted distributions. Given that much of our questionnaire content is related to geopolitics and subsequent tables about attitudinal results may raise concerns about the political leanings of our samples. In terms of the two most prominent political parties, the far-right Swedish Democrats and the center-left Social Democrats, the differences between phone and push-to-web are generally within a few points, with the push-to-web samples, if anything, tilting just a bit more conservative by this metric. Note that the parameter for partisan identification is marked with an asterisk, as those are 2022 parliamentary election figures, which can make for a problematic comparison, not really a parameter at all, but I figured you folks might be curious about the election results. In terms of ideology, asked in our surveys as using a 0 to 6 scale ranging from extreme left to extreme right, the mode differences are starker, with push to web looking more left-leaning and less right-leaning versus phone, at least by this metric. All right, I promised you some attitudinal comparisons. And here we have on this slide. Okay, I'll show you a few of these attitudinal differences, and they're important as we weigh the implications of migrating to push to web from our standard phone survey in Sweden. And this table gives you a sense of what those results might look like. On this slide, I pulled 17 items that were on both questionnaires. These represent core gap attitudinal items, such as U.S. image, views of the U.S. president, and domestic opinions. I added an item that asked about the morality and ethics of Swedes, as well as a few items from a related battery asking about the morality of specific issues, an affair between married people, homosexuality, and abortion. The table is arranged with weighted estimates, first from the phone survey, followed by the two flavors of push to web I've been talking about. A quick note on item non-response here, folks, which I didn't include in the slide. Overall, it's minimal across the board, ranging from 0 to 4% on each item and averaging about 1 to 2% for each mode. In general, regarding the attitudinal point estimate differences, most differences are under 5 points between phone and push to web samples. This is the case with the country favorability battery on the US, China, and Russia, confidence in leaders from those countries, and for the most part, views of the US president. Not seeing massive distortion is potentially good news for trending items over time, especially with questions of high editorial interest, such as these geopolitical and US image items. Now, where we tend to see larger differences overall, and I grade the background of those items on the slide, or on some questions that one could argue are more sensitive and tap into a social desirability differential by mode. That is a greater willingness on self-administered surveys like push to web to express more polarizing opinions, as there's no interviewer for a respondent to account for in expressing their views. With that in mind, we see a 9-point difference between phone and push to web and willingness to express support for the far-right political party, Sweden Democrats. We also see lower prevalence on push to web to express a positive view of the morality and ethics of Swedes, as well as a lower tendency on push to web to say that homosexuality and abortion are morally acceptable. We also find lower proportions expressing satisfaction with Sweden's democracy. Now, one could hypothesize that the push to web results for some of these items with large differences, in particular the items on homosexuality, abortion, and the morality and ethics of Swedes, may be more accurate than those from the phone because of the presence of an interviewer. And that argument is based on the view that despite some recent shifting on immigration and law and order issues in Sweden, Sweden remains a comparatively progressive country given its robust welfare state and high gender equality and inclusivity. All told, the attitudinal differences by mode tend not to be large, and where we see large differences, there's a sensibility to the direction. Okay. Now, I thought it would be interesting to share a bit more about partisan differences and try and disentangle partisan identity and mode. On this slide, I have three-way tables comparing the mode differences on a few of the attitudinal items among Sweden Democrats and Social Democrats separately. Notice the slightly more subdued attitudes in the interviewer-administered phone survey among self-described Sweden Democrats when asked for favorability about their own party, as well as for favorability of the Social Democratic Party. However, mode seems to have little impact on those aligning with the leading Social Democratic Party when it comes to these favorability measures. But on those morality items, We generally see the self-described partisans in both parties expressing more negative views about the acceptability of homosexuality and abortion when using the push-to-web self-completion mode in comparison to phone. Now, more work on these items has to be done so we can conclusively or more conclusively point to mode differences. We need to consider the ideological leanings of the partisan affiliates. Perhaps the Sweden Democrats reached by phone are more left-leaning than those reached by push-to-web. We need to look at how these patterns play out on different measures, the geopolitical ones, including the social values ones. But it's a line of research we're pursuing, again, since integrating push-to-web into the broader Global Attitudes Project is the ultimate goal, and understanding distortions in our long-term trends is a priority. All right. Looking ahead, folks, talk about a few next steps. Well, we need to review closely the value of incentives and compare them to what others have found, particularly the ESS findings. And the goal is to make the survey more affordable while minimizing loss in sample representativeness and response rates. There's evidence that providing any unconditional incentive is superior to providing none at all, but the optimal combination of unconditional incentives is something that we're looking into now. No incentive on the first mailing, but one on the third. As I mentioned earlier, that seems to offer some promising results demographically. Certainly not including incentives on every mailing can be a more budget-friendly approach. We need to review closely the value of the paper questionnaire in comparison to online response and with respect to project timelines and staff bandwidth. As I mentioned, paper response certainly offsets the education skew of the online sample, but it's a trade-off with age, as most paper respondents in the survey were seniors. One challenge with extrapolating from our paper completes is that the delay in delivery of the third mailing may have depressed response and led to less representative outcomes. We need to review the adaptations of converting the online instrument to a paper questionnaire. The goal is to make the interviewer-administered questionnaire by phone more suitable for self-administration, but we need to review any distortion attributable to those changes. Thankfully, many of the modifications strike me as benign, such as removing the response options from the push-to-web question text, but it warrants review. And we need to analyze more closely data quality metrics across modes, including measures of survey engagement, such as item non-response, straight lining, number of words to open-ended questions, and so on. That work isn't yet complete. Looking further ahead, for future projects, we need to investigate whether we can leverage information on the frame, say to use targeted mailings to reduce costs, such as sending paper questionnaires only to older respondents, or send text messages as reminders. For our future work, and I underscored this a few times during the talk, we need to look carefully into the local in-country vendor options, given the transit issues and other problems that arose from the cross-national setup that we applied. For this project, we aim to leverage the experience and expertise of a high-quality vendor, but their location was not in Sweden, and it caused several snafus. We experienced delays in exporting letters to Sweden from the UK due to the dock worker strike, delays in importing paper returns to the UK for scanning and processing from Sweden due to challenges with the transit partner, and unfortunately, we ran into a shortage of Swedish krona for unconditional incentives as the letters were prepared in the UK. The delays we experienced would have been highly problematic for the Global Attitudes Project on our cross-national schedule. In fact, how things panned out, we might not have been able to report on Sweden in much of our cross-national reporting for GAP 2025, and that would have been highly problematic. However, this project wasn't a part of GAP 25, and that's why we explore, we test, and hopefully we learn how to do things a little bit better next time. Despite these hiccups, based on these preliminary analyses and the known disadvantages of surveying Sweden by phone, the push-to-web approach strikes us as a viable option and offers us a potential alternative of data collection in Sweden for upcoming waves of the Global Attitudes Project. Thank you.
All right. Awesome. Thank you so much, Pat, for the presentation. And We have a couple minutes for questions from the audience. You guys can raise your hand, you can type on the chat. Feel free.
You can say words. I've said plenty of them.
All right. I have one in the chat from Clara. As you push to online surveys, are you concerned about AI generated responses?
Um, yeah, I mean that's a good question. Remember with the push to web that we're using that we sampled folks directly and we invited them directly. So I think we're at less of a disadvantage in terms of like bots, bot farms, and those kinds of issues. I mean, there could be issues with AI if a survey respondent wants to program AI to take the survey for them. I'm not sure our incentives are high enough where folks would be encouraged to do that. I suppose folks could also use AI for helping them with open-ended responses. That's something for us to think a little bit about too. And if they do that, whether it's problematic or not, I think a lot of folks use AI to tighten their language, um, in correspondence. It's something I think it's definitely something for us to think more about here. But I think the push to web approach is perhaps in a slightly different category with the online response than, say, non-probability surveys.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think the AI is a bigger concern in on surveys that you recruit participants on social media, especially.
Mhm. Yeah.
Who's next? Oh, all right. Got another one in the chat from Glenn. I was wondering whether the registry used for the sampling frame includes email addresses that might be used.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, Glenn. I kind of poked at that a little bit at the end in terms of leveraging more information from the sample frame. In Sweden, we didn't try to append additional information. I don't recall off the top of my head, and I can get back to you on whether email was in there and how often it was in there. There are opportunities the a vendor suggested about appending auxiliary information from other sources, but that's something we can think about, but we'd have to verify those sources and the quality of those information. But I think, Glenn, you're thinking along the right in the right direction about what we can leverage from these sample frames to improve our designs, to, in your case, with email addresses, to reach out to respondents and reach them where they're at and give them ways to complete the survey that are as accessible as possible. I know in some countries, in Nordic countries, there are digital mailboxes, and there was some discussion early on with our vendors about how to integrate them into this project. We put that aside since internationally we had not used push to web ever. And that seemed like an additional road to go down that perhaps we weren't prepared for. But I think you're thinking along the right track, Glenn. I think we can maybe do a little bit better in terms of our sampling and maybe targeted sampling. That's where my mind goes with additional information from the frame.
Awesome. Who wants to go next? Yeah, Isadora, please.
Hi, thank you for this talk. I'm really interested in this the address register and whether you've done any work to m match, confirm the genders of the names with the unique QR codes, just to do some like check on like quality of, quality, and whether you've extrapolated median income per postal address to the um, to the to the reported income or yeah, done any sort of like um uh
Like a
yeah,
validation?
yeah, validation kind of, yeah, exactly. Just to check how
Hmm.
against, yeah, some other like census data.
Yeah, no, that's good. We hadn't actually thought about that. It hasn't come up in our discussion. So it's something that we could perhaps aggregate and see if we can match. Our income question is not great. I'd say that admittedly that we use, but it's definitely a path to go on. And I appreciate it because I think it's those types of validations, other than just comparing these kind of like gross demographics, I think would add a lot more credibility to this type of work. Um, so we have not done that. And interesting idea with possible experimentation. To be honest with you, I have shared all of our experimentation with this project, and that was the incentive experiment. That was the sum total of it. But so your idea was with the QR codes, or in terms of the access to change the mailing in some way to to match with the sampled individual's characteristics.
No, just to validate what the responses,
Hmm.
what the respondents are saying regarding, like, I mean, the two things that you can extrapolate
Hmm.
from the official registry, which
Hmm.
is, guesstimate whether the name is male, female.
Hmm.
Um, I'm not sure if Sweden has one of those conventions where it's like very clearly, if it has an ending of whatever. But um,
Hmm.
and and the just the the respondent was placed at this postal address.
Hmm.
Median income is this. Are they above, below,
Hmm.
or do they self-report to be above, below? And especially since those kind of sociodemographics you mentioned, um, the differences in response rates, gender, income. I mean, age is less. Maybe there's census data on how many like percent of
Hmm.
retirees, and
Yeah.
but where you could also kind of like estimate the probability
Yeah.
of being retired or not. But yeah, I mean, just as that, because it's such a unique
Hmm.
uh, um, data that you start out with,
Yeah.
such a unique sampling strategy. So yeah, and that it might validate,
Yeah.
how push to web is reflective of these known
Yeah.
sociodemographics.
Yeah. I love
Yeah.
where you're going with that. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I'm thinking oftentimes like in terms of the next project and leveraging that type of information to do more targeted mailings and whatnot, which is
Mhm.
possible. I love kind of working backwards to validate because I think we can do better on that in that regard in terms of like thinking about how well this performed. So that's great. That's great dialogue there. Thank you.
Thanks.
Cool. I'll go next, Pat. And one of some of the results that I was surprised with the push to web, despite the higher response rate, was about how education and right-wing ideology were underrepresented. So in Latin America, that's very common to have like education underrepresented in online surveys. And that's one, I would say, the main drivers why we at La Pop still conducts like face-to-face because it's still simply impossible to obtain a representative sample in terms of education if you conduct it online in Latin America. So I was a little bit surprised that that's happening in Europe too. And the second one about right-wing ideology, it's interesting because that's something that we see in the US that has become very hard to recruit Republicans in online service in the US. and we're seeing the same in Sweden. So I just saw these two parallels with these two distinct regions, and yeah, just wanted to hear a little bit about your experience on this two variables.
Yeah, no, Robert, I'm right there with you. Part of the push to try push to web and to try alternative modes is to address, sample deficiencies. And frankly, the two variables that you point to are
Mhm.
two of the key concerns.
Yeah.
Uh, and then those two variables show up as problematic in our sample surveys. Um, Less so partisanship, because I think that's a little bit harder to pin down in places, but certainly the education deficiencies that we get with our phone surveys. And as you can see here with the push to web, you know, I don't think we've addressed that issue here, at least with this one test case. Um, yeah, we can look at other incentive combinations. I mentioned one that I didn't show that did a little bit better on education. That's with no first mailing incentive, but one on the third mailing, definitely including paper that helps with education. And that's one of the reasons why on the NPORS project domestically in the US, and one of the key reasons why they also include paper is to shore up the education balance and the distribution. We certainly haven't addressed that adequately here. And the concern I raised in the talk is that oftentimes with the demographics, it's not zero sum, right? So we try and shore up education. I'm curious about your Latin American experience, um, but we can do that, but perhaps at the expense of age. And then our age
Mm.
distribution now, where we have a fairly balanced distribution in terms of age on push to web, that could become much more distorted by saying, trying to address the education problem. So I don't have a clear solution for that one. I think if we go back to Isadora's point about leveraging, at least in Sweden, frame information and perhaps auxiliary information that we can append to the frame, perhaps we can target mailings in a certain way. And we were talking a moment ago a little bit about, income areas or places with, different age distributions. But if it's possible to target mailings to address the education deficiencies, that would be, I think, one way to go. Or it's leveraging, perhaps in a more robust way, the incentives that we offered. I mean, perhaps, 20 krona, which is in the US, that's about a couple bucks, and 60, with the third mailing unconditional, that's around like $7 or something like that. Perhaps that wasn't enough to quite move the needle. So there's a little play here. And some of the other projects that I mentioned, I think they might do a little bit better on some of the demographics, and they offered higher incentives than we did.
Great. Yeah, in Latin America, this correlation between education age that you mentioned is also the same.
Mhm.
Right. So we have time
I
for one
ha-
last burning
Okay.
question.
I have a comment.
Yeah.
My name is Indiana, and what it's actually on what you're talking. I'm from Latin America too,
Mhm.
and but one of our concerns is participation. Individuals have started to lose interest in this type of activities in responding surveys, and I think this is becoming a generational component where younger generations are less interested in answering social questions, or at least the way we are framing it. I think we need to reconsider that. I've seen it in two ways. I have students that we have been working with students where we're trying to attract their participation in classes and doing it the kind of old way or old style has started to be very obsolete, and they have been pushing us to change and be more do more active learning and even have more active questions that really have them to discuss what they're interested or how they see things. I would say that's one. The second one is with the incentives. When most of the time when the university has surveys they want students to be responding to, we started to notice that providing some kind of monetary incentive was not attractive any longer, but instead having digital gift cards for games or shopping on Amazon or things like that started to be more attractive to them, and they were like, "Yeah, those are the things we want to know." So finding out the population age we want to target, along with the fact that we want to what they're interested of, I think would be very useful. I've done it before, and I participated in a research study for a week for women's infant children program here, and we started to notice the same. We were trying to provide incentives, and they were like, "Ah, we don't care. We don't want to sit down for an hour whatsoever to be part of it." Interestingly, we got most Latin American women to participate, and it was not for the fact of the money. It was a Walmart gift card they were getting, and they loved it because they were like, "Oh, I can use this for me," and we wanted to hear women. Where it was Spanish, English speaking women, they were like, "Well, a gift card, we're not interested." So we started to see what they were interested in, and I think they ended up providing them something different, a different type of gift, digital platform as well, and it worked greatly. So I think those are the things we have to keep in mind, especially I have to do, most of the time I do qualitative studies and have to do interviews, and having people engage and participate is so difficult. So having to put in time to think of who do we want to target? What are the real interested? Are we framing the words or the questions the way they want to hear them about? Because sometimes we need that. Sometimes we have it done for so many decades the same way, and they're like, "Well, we see nothing, or we're just changing things the way or words the way they're doing it." Sometimes the other day I was talking with my kids, and the way I call things in English for them is different. And they're like, "Oh, we no longer call XYZ that way. We call it differently." I was like, "But we mean the same, right?" And they're like, "Yeah, but this is generational, mom. You gotta modernize." And I was like, God, all those kind of things are sometimes important, I would say. I don't know what your experience or what you would think about it, but especially if we're pushing to online, I think it's very important we start doing and connecting, because it's killing me the fact that students want to leave online. They're living in online world, even in real world. They're like, sometimes, why don't we have our class online? Let's do everything online, and let's think online. And I'm like, gosh, so all this kind of connection and real social world problems are being lost there.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. I think there's a lot to agree with what you said. Really reaching respondents where they are, and it's kind of, kind of like rolling out, especially for a project like GAP, kind of rolling it out year after year the same way, and you can, kind of hide, kind of beneath the banner of like protecting your trend and whatnot. But at what cost? So I like the ideas about targeting incentives. In some ways, push to web is this kind of like small step in that direction, because other than for us moving away from a phone survey, because frankly you wonder who's answering the phone, and I have bad survey karma, but my ringer is always turned off. If you're trying to reach me, please don't call, because you'll never get a hold of me. um, so it's one small step, but I like what you were saying, and Isadora before, about like going another step. I mean, you really, can leverage perhaps more information and engage with them. And certainly on the questionnaire, as you were saying, we can always do a better job with that. And there are a lot of known ways, from cognitive interviewing, focus groups, and the qualitative work you were mentioning, that we can reach them a bit better. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, once again, thank you, Pat, for being here. And I would like to invite everyone for our next and final wisdom of the spring semester. We're gonna have Bo Chan, who's an assistant professor at the University of Newcastle University on April 15th. Okay, same time, same place. The title of the talk will be Autocratization Spillover: Can Autocratization Events Abroad Change Citizens' Democrat Attitudes? So I hope to see everyone there.
Robert,
Yeah, Pat,
can I just throw out a thank you to you, to everyone for showing up, for the great
of
questions.
course.
My email address is on here, folks, on this last slide. Please, this is an unfolding area of research for us. It's fun to come out here and I get to talk for 35 minutes because who doesn't like doing that? But more important is the follow-up, the ideas people can share to inform our work and to engage. That's really the value of showing up to the workshop.
Awesome. Fantastic. Thank you again, Pat. And everyone, have a good day.